Okay, hello everyone. I'm Edwin Rutsch, the director of the Empathy Center, and today I'm here with William Ickes for a discussion about empathy, my favorite topic. And Bill is on the phone line, so we're doing this on Zoom over the phone, over his phone line. And let me just give a little introduction to Bill. This is what I found on Wikipedia. Bill is a personality and social psychologist who is known primarily for his research on unstructured didactic interaction. And he's the author of the books Everyday Mind Reading, Understanding What Other People Think and Feel, and Strangers in a Strange Lab, How Personality Shapes Our Initial Encounters with Others. And he's also the editor of the book Empathic Accuracy. And Bill, I'm just going to hold those books up. I have copies of Empathic Accuracy and Everyday Mind Reading here. So I'm just holding those up for viewers to be able to see. And you also have done numerous studies and papers on the topic of empathic accuracy. Is there more by way of introduction you'd like to share?
Well, maybe to point out what could be obvious, and that is that I don't study empathy broad scale. I just study an aspect of it, which is empathic accuracy. How accurate are we when we try to make inferences about what other people are thinking and feeling?
And you've been doing this for quite a while. When did you get started on this topic area of study?
I can give you a long answer, which you can edit later if you like. But
Yeah, just tell me the whole story.
okay, listeners might like to know that there is a broader story. Um, when I got out of graduate school and took my first academic job at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I made a decision to study people's initial interactions. And one of my colleagues in social psychology there at Wisconsin, who basically was hired at the same time I was a guy named D.W. Rutsch. He'd been trained as a comparative psychologist. He did studies of social behavior using animals, specifically hatchlings, as his research participants. And as we talked, he told me how in the lab meetings, one of the first things they did was to acknowledge that none of them really knew a whole lot about the behavioral repertoire of newly hatched baby chicks. And so they went to the research literature and they did some brainstorming in their meetings and they tried to come up with a list of the various behaviors that baby chicks were capable of. Well, that impressed me as somebody who had made the decision to study initial human interactions between strangers. And so in my lab meeting, we did basically the same thing. We started with a list of behaviors that we would expect to see in initial interactions between strangers. And we used those behaviors to record what was going on in people's initial interactions. For several years, we were studying how people's personalities affected these interactions. Um, we would mix and match people according to personality type, and when we analyzed the data, we could see in a fairly clear and detailed way how different aspects of personality played out in the form of specific behaviors. I became a little bit manic about the idea of wanting to get everything possible out of these videotapes of the interactions we were recording. And so my next goal was to go beyond the behaviors which show up on the tapes, try to get an idea of what's going on inside the people's heads. And so just as I borrowed from Rutsch, the idea of cataloging all of the behaviors and then measuring them, I borrowed from researchers at Ohio State something they called the thought listing paradigm, the thought listing procedure. And they had developed forms where people simply at points at which an interaction recorded on videotape is paused or stopped, people write down the particular thought or feeling that they had at that point. And if you continue with that pause, record kind of procedure, you can eventually get all of the thoughts and feelings that the person had. Now, I realized that we couldn't interrupt live interactions to have people record their own thoughts and feelings as they're also trying to talk to a stranger. So what we did was the next best thing. We had them sit in separate cubicles immediately after the interaction, and we had them pause the tape of the interaction that they had just been in at each of the points where they remember distinctly having had a particular thought or feeling. Meanwhile, their partner is sitting in a different cubicle doing the same thing, pausing the tape and writing down their thoughts and feelings. And eventually it occurred to me, since we were able to record people's retrospective thoughts and feelings with, I think, a fairly high degree of accuracy, why not take these thought feeling data and then have people view the tape a second time. On this pass through the tape, they don't pause the tape, we do. We pause it at each of the points where their interaction partner had a thought or feeling. And now their job is to write down at each of those points what they think their partner was thinking or feeling in the form of a sentence. So this was the basis of our method for measuring each partner's empathic accuracy. We now have, for each of the individuals, an actual thought or feeling reported by one of them, and then we have an inference that the other partner made about what that thought or feeling was. Each of them results in a sentence, and the next step in the process was to develop software where our undergraduate research assistants could compare an actual thought or feeling, which one partner had reported, with the inferred thought or feeling that the other person came up with. And then they make similarity judgments based on whether they got the gist of the thought or feeling right, whether it was similar but not the same, or whether it was completely different, dissimilar. And when we assign numerical codes to each of those, we can then create a sum to measure across an entire interaction period of how many accuracy points each person got, how successful overall they were at inferring their partner's thoughts or feelings. So the longer version of this story, which I've been giving you, is that we started out wanting to study social interaction. We were essentially looking at things that could be seen and recorded off videotape, like smiles and laughter, times when people spoke, when they turned their head to look at each other, how close or far they sat from each other, and so on. But eventually we tried to take the research in the direction of what's going on in the two people's heads, and that's when we began to study their actual thoughts and feelings. And then the next logical step, which was 10 years from when I first started doing this research, trying to study how accurately each partner could infer the other person's thoughts and feelings. So what we were studying at that point, we decided to label empathic accuracy because we were, after all, able to get numerical estimates of how accurate each person was in coming up with a thought feeling inference that matched the actual thought or feeling reported by their partner.
Well, the a lot of the work that I do is based on the work of Carl Rogers, who did a lot of work exploring the nature of empathy within a client therapist relationship. And I saw that you had mentioned him in some of your writings. You had mentioned him. I was wondering, was he an influence at all on that interest in empathic accuracy, or where did that shift come from studying personalities to getting interested in empathic accuracy?
Well, once our focus had shifted from only being able to extract interaction behaviors that were observable from our videotapes to being curious about what was going on in the partners' heads, what their thoughts and feelings were, then the method sort of drove our research interest in empathic accuracy. The fact that we could assess empathic accuracy with the procedures we've been developing made it something that we decided we really wanted to do. And when we searched for precedents in the literature, we didn't really find anybody else doing this. However, we did find that Carl Rogers in the 1950s had talked about not empathic accuracy, but accurate empathy.
Mm.
He had those two terms reversed from the way we were thinking of them. We were emphasizing the accuracy part of it. He was focusing on what the therapist is capable of, and so he used the term accurate empathy. And it turned out that his view of what that was very similar, if not identical, to what we were calling empathic accuracy. He said that the ideal therapist can track moment by moment what seems to be going on in the mind, the consciousness of the patient, and therapists presumably should get better at this over time. Um, but although individual differences in the ability to do this may vary, it's the obligation of the therapist to do the best they can to try to track what's going on with the other person. Well, we have a way to do that now with the methods that we developed. And so Roger's term, accurate empathy, was indeed an important precedent for us, even though we had a method that was something that I think he probably would have aspired to back in the 1950s, but wasn't doing back then.
Yeah, the as I was mentioning, our work is based on his active listening process. So he just to kind of give a little picture of how he did his listening. He, as a therapist, he would listen to his clients. The clients would speak about whatever is going on in their lives, and he, as a therapist, would reflect back his understanding of what they were saying, and they would either agree with them. They'll say, "Yeah, they sort of feel like they were heard or understood," or if they didn't feel heard, accurately, people tend to correct and say how they really were feeling. Like, "Oh, you're feeling angry." They say, "No, I'm just upset," for example. To get kind of closer to the actual experience of the speaker. And we've taken that structure and put it into small groups. So we'll have maybe four people in a small group, and we have a topic, and one person is the speaker, and they speak. They select their listener, and that listener does the active listening, reflecting back their understanding of what the speaker is saying. And then we have time limits, maybe 5 minute per turn. And then when that time is up, the listener becomes the speaker, and they speak, select someone in the group to speak to, and this conversation like this goes on, for the time allotted. So that's sort of one way of getting to empathic accuracy, is that the person that you're speaking to, you're reflecting back your understanding of what they're saying, and then they sort of guide you as if they're heard, if they're understood, or not. And Yeah, so we've doing a lot of work with holding these kind of empathy circles out in the public, and use it for conflict mediation and a lot of other, different ways. And so what you have is another approach to determining empathic accuracy, where you're actually recording those just normal interactions, and then people after the fact share what it is that they were feeling, and others are sort of guessing or saying what they feel that the other person is saying or experiencing, and then you're sort of matching those together to get a sort of a determination of how accurate they are. Is that sort of
Yeah, and I think that apart from Roger's preferred term of mirroring, another way to try to get at the gist of what he was doing is to think about it in terms of soliciting feedback and getting the feedback from the person who had the thought or feeling and using that to correct your inference making in the future. Um, what's important is not just any kind of feedback, it's veridical feedback. What makes that technique work in Roger's original use of it, what makes it work in our empathic accuracy research is getting accurate veridical feedback from the other person.
right?
Now
Uh-huh.
we decided that was important and was something that we wanted to look at. We had to figure out how to do it within the context of our research procedure. And so in an early study we did, we had people listen to tapes that might have been recorded by Carl Rogers. They were tapes in which a client-centered therapist like him was having a simulated, but in most respects, very realistic therapy session with a female client. These women were told that they would be involved in a 50-minute therapy session. They could talk about a problem in their life that they wanted to discuss. The guy was a real therapist trained in that tradition. They knew that the session would be recorded on videotape. So we did as much as we could to make these tapes resemble actual therapy sessions. Um, at the end of the session, we did what we did with the strangers who interacted in our lab. We took the female clients to a cubicle where they sat down and reviewed the copy of the videotape of the session they were just in. They paused the tape at each of the points where they had a clearly remembered thought or feeling, and they made a complete list of all those thoughts and feelings. We emphasized how important it was that they report their thoughts and feelings accurately, that they didn't put down ones that they think they might have had, and it had to be ones they were sure about. So now we not only have a list of their thoughts and feelings, but we have reason to believe that if they were asked to provide feedback, this is as close as they can get to being accurate in describing the actual thoughts and feelings they had. Then we did a study where we had our undergraduates essentially play amateur psychotherapists. We showed the undergraduates these 50-minute therapy sessions. We paused the tape in each therapy session at all of the points where the client had actually reported a thought or feeling. And we asked our undergraduates, okay, pretend like you're a therapist here. What did the client at this point tell us that she was thinking or she was feeling? And they wrote down their inferences. In one condition, we wanted to provide them with feedback about what the client was actually thinking and feeling. And so for those people on a number of the trials, so to speak, each time they wrote down their inference about what the client was thinking or feeling, what appeared on the screen next was not an immediate continuation of the therapy session. What appeared instead was the client's actual thought or feeling. And this was the way that we could provide our research participants with immediate and accurate, veridical feedback about the client's thought or feeling. So some people got this feedback, and it was corrective, I'm sure, in the same way that it was when Rogers solicited this feedback in his clinical work. People in a different condition did not get the feedback trials. They made their inference about what the client was thinking or feeling, and then they just went on and continued with viewing the interaction, the therapy session, and made additional inferences as the occasion occurred. And our question was, does getting this accurate feedback about what the client's real thought or feeling was immediately after you've already made your guess, does that improve the accuracy of your future guesses, of your future inferences? And we found that it did.
Mm-hmm.
We found that we could, in effect, train people's empathic accuracy over the course of these 3 therapy sessions, which was really kind of amazing. We estimated that participating in the feedback condition and hearing the actual thoughts and feelings of the 3 female clients immediately after you've guessed what each of their thoughts and feelings were could boost the average participant's empathic accuracy around 10% compared to the people who did not get the immediate feedback. So Rogers was clearly onto something, and his technique for eliciting feedback, basically just, here's what I think you just said, or here's what I think you were telling me about your current feelings. Is that right? That's perfectly good, and it's a valid way to get the kind of feedback that we only usually get with pretty close friends. We don't enter most conversations with the mental set that I'm going to pause this conversation every time I'm not quite sure I understood you. That would be tedious and probably annoying. In the context of a therapy session, though, it makes perfect sense that we would stop and do that correcting and get repeated feedback, make sure that I'm tracking your thoughts and feelings accurately. So,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, so your research is showing that getting that reflection, getting that confirmation of how well you heard someone and understood them actually increases the listener's level of empathy by 10% about. So it's one way to improve your empathy accuracy.
Yeah, one way to think about it is that you make small corrections in your inference making, or you may even make larger ones. There may be course corrections where you thought that one issue was the patient's primary concern and reason for being there, and it turns out that when you see the patient's actual thought or feeling and compare it with your inferred thought or feeling, you realize, well, no, I'm sort of going off in the wrong direction here. I need to be focused on this, on issue A instead of issue B. And some of these course corrections based on the feedback may be small, but others may be sizable.
But the participants who are trying to read these emotions, feelings, thoughts, they're seeing a video. Is that correct? So they're actually seeing a recording of this person versus the person themselves, and then they're being told by someone who's there if they're accurate or not. Is that?
So what they're doing is they're seeing the therapy session. If you can imagine where the camera's positioned, it would be behind the male therapist's head. So they would see in the center of the image they would see the female client sitting in her chair on the other side of the desk from the male therapist. The camera would be focused on her. It would pick up her nonverbal behavior. Obviously, they could see her lips moving, hear what she's saying. They would only hear, as a kind of voiceover, the male therapist part of the conversation. Everything he said, they would hear, but they wouldn't. They wouldn't be focused on looking at him. It would be sort of shot over his shoulder, so to speak. And then they would hit a point where the female client had paused the tape and had reported a thought or feeling. We would pause the tape for the research participant at that point, and they would try to infer by writing in the form of a sentence what the female client's thought or feeling was. And people in the feedback condition, instead of seeing the interaction continue from that point, would first see appear on the videotape. They would see the client's actual reported thought or feeling. This is immediately after they've reported their inferred thought or feeling, and now they're getting corrective feedback. It may indicate to them, well, that's exactly what I thought she was thinking or feeling. I'm not surprised a bit. Or that's similar to what I was thinking, but it's interesting because it's different in this way. Or wait, that's completely different from what I thought was going on with her. So it's like what Rogers was doing in therapy, but it's less intrusive, and obviously there's no changing that videotaped interaction. It is what it is. But what we are changing by giving the perceivers, the undergraduates who are playing amateur psychotherapists, what we are giving them is a chance to see what the actual thought or feeling was each time one was reported, and use that information ideally to correct their subsequent inferences and make them better. And what that meant, we predicted, was that people would tend to do better at the end of the tape, the last set of thoughts and feelings that they had to infer, than at the beginning, because if they were in that feedback condition, they would have had the corrective feedback all through the tape. And that's what we found, that the people in the feedback condition did do better in those last those final set of inferences than the people who were in the no feedback condition, didn't have a chance or as much of a chance to correct their perceptions of what the client was thinking and feeling.
So you're thinking the
Now there is
improvement there was because they were getting that feedback. So it's that feedback is what's improving it towards the end.
There's two things. One is that even without feedback, as you continue to listen to the person talk and express their concerns, what they talk about and how they talk about it and how they relate it to what they talked about earlier, that provides another form of feedback. They're providing their own further clarification, correction, additional insight, context. So that's something that occurs even if you're not in the feedback condition. You are probably benefiting from this accumulating knowledge of what the person is saying and using that to improve the accuracy of your subsequent inferences. But if you're in the feedback condition, not only do you get that cumulative effect of getting to know the person better, but you also get an immediate feedback on the particular inferences that you made early on and whether they were accurate or not, and in what ways you were inaccurate. So Rogers was on to something really important, the whole concept of accurate empathy, and then attempting to try to improve the therapist's accurate empathy through seeking direct feedback after virtually every exchange with the client and making that a very public event. That's a wonderful technique. We just had to find a way to do that without having to essentially interrupt the flow of the therapy session.
Well, as I was mentioning, we're building on that and taking it out of the therapeutic and bringing it into the relational. Just people, non-therapists, just taking it out of the therapeutic context and bringing it into just human interaction.
I
So we'll
think
have something called empathy cafes, which is we'll have any number of people, join. There could be like 30 or 40 people. We give an explanation of how the empathy circle works, and then we divide people into smaller groups of 4 or 5. And then we do the empathy, the active listening in small groups like that. So we're trying to mainstream it. Take that practice and make. We'd like to train everyone in the world how to take part in an empathy circle, because I think it really helps raise the level of empathy. And we've done it, with the political left, political right, bring them into an empathy circle, have them listen to each other and reflect back their understandings. And the this was mentioned, just I don't know if you saw that article in the Scientific America that they talked about our work, where we would have this empathy tent that would go out to where these demonstrations are, where the political left and right are sort of battling it out. They're screaming and yelling at each other. We'd bring one person from each side into the tent, and I would mediate with them or do an empathy circle. And at the end, they would hug each other. So, and it's in a documentary called Trump Phobia, What Both Sides Fear. They showed that. So, this accurate empathy and core, this empathic processes, I think just has huge benefits for social interaction. It's something we really need in the world right now.
I think you're right, and I also think that it invites the question: well, why haven't human interaction patterns evolved to bring this into everyday interactions all the time? Why aren't we all doing it all the time? It's unusual behavior. As I mentioned earlier, apart from very close friends or people who you work with and feel you can trust, we don't frequently say, "Well, I think you're feeling this way," or "Am I right or am I wrong?" It's considered, I think, disruptive and impolite to keep interrupting people and asking if you inferred them correctly. And it may even suggest that you're not paying attention if you have to keep doing that. But it's a remarkably effective technique, as Rogers found, as we found, as you found. So maybe we ought to legitimize this, that it's perfectly okay for even strangers to question each other, to try to get clarity on what the other person's thinking and feeling, given the amazing benefits that it has to offer.
You have any thoughts on how we can popularize it? How do we get it out there to? I mean, I thought if during the elections, if like Trump and Harris had done an empathy circle instead of a debate, and modeled it, if we had high-profile people like that modeling, or in Congress, if Congress, the Democrats and Republicans had to have empathy circles, once a month or something between each other, and people could observe it and sort of mainstream it, make it sort of a common way of being. Yeah.
Well, I think that if I think that's a great idea, but I think there'd be a lot of self-selection. It was only people who are pretty open to others who'd be willing to participate in those empathy circles in the context of a political campaign or election. But if I were to take your technique and try to make it part of people's everyday behavior, I would argue that you ought to try to figure out how to get it into the public schools at the
Mm.
elementary school level. Have kids do your empathy circle um, exercises and get used to it. They will naturally, I expect, generalize it outside of the formal empathy circle. They'll begin to talk to each other in the halls, um, in the lunchroom, questioning each other's thoughts and feelings, asking, "Here's what I think's going on with you. Here's what I think you're feeling. Am I right?" And if it becomes legitimized at that level, so that people not only feel like it's valuable and useful, but that they're encouraged to do it in everyday life, and they grow up with that, I think that we could potentially create another generation of people who benefit from this more than previous ones have.
Yeah, that's really our goal, is to bring it into all, aspects of society, including the schools. We're looking at how do we get it into the schools like that, at first it's a very structured process where you have to sort of follow the rules, turn taking. What I find, it's really a mindset as well. And once you've done it for a while, you sort of internalize that mindset. So you're sort of, even when you're just listening to someone, you're sort of reflecting back your understanding to what they're saying, staying present, not non-judgmental, and all the things that sort of block that empathy, like judgment and detachment, or not paying attention, or not being present. But you start internalizing it, so it just sort of becomes part of your personality, which is, I guess, what you were sort of studying to begin with. Was people's sort of personalities and how that related to how they interacted with each other? Is that was like your original sort of what you were looking
But
at?
back when we first started doing it,
Mm-hmm.
we were just looking at how does my personality affect how much I talk, smile, gesture, and how does your personality contribute? And so we would do things like create pairs of people where they were both extroverts, or they were both introverts, or one was an introvert and one was an extrovert. In the studies where we only looked at strangers, we wanted to try to put these people in a waiting room situation and just capture their initial interaction, where the thing that was most likely to influence how the interaction progressed was the personality of the two individuals. They didn't know why they were there. They hadn't. They were waiting for the experiment to begin. Hadn't been told really anything about it. If we just leave them together, waiting for the experimenter to come in, but unobtrusively record on videotape and on sound their interaction, there's reason I thought to expect that different combinations would have different kinds of interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to give one example, in one rather large study, we did set it up so that we had people who, based on information they'd given us earlier, were determined to be introverts or extroverts. And we created the different combinations that I just mentioned: two introverts together, two extroverts together, or an introvert paired with an extrovert. In a similar study, we looked at the personality dimension of agreeableness. So we had either two agreeable people who were interacting, or two disagreeable people, or an agreeable person paired with a disagreeable one. And basically, what we found in that study was that two disagreeable people don't get along. Two agreeable people do, but an agreeable person gets along fine with a disagreeable one. It's that agreeable person's personality that seems to set the tone for the interaction. It isn't spoiled by the fact that the agreeable person has a disagreeable partner. But the real problem type was when they were both disagreeable. They found ways to sour what is normally, expected to be a pleasant initial interaction.
Yeah, to compare that with, I had to see if you had someone who, or a group who had done like the empathy circle practice, for a while, and then they got together in those sort of contexts to see what effect that would have. If you've taken part in an empathy circle, how does that sort of affect your interactions? I'm just thinking of someone in our group. She just mentioned recently, she's been doing the empathy circle in our training. And then she was driving with her son, and her son brought up some issue with the family. And then she got sort of defensive and started, saying, "Oh, well, I don't think that was true," or just got defensive about it. And then he told her, "Say, oh yeah, you're right, whatever you want." Just sort of dismissing it and kind of ending the conversation. And then she thought, well, I'm doing this empathic listening. Maybe I should try it. And then she just sort of reflected back what he was saying, and he talked some more and some more. And she said it just turned out into a really great conversation and a day, a really positive day came out of it. So it was just the learning how to do that empathic listening. And he didn't do it in return. He didn't even know that she was really doing it. Just her willingness to listen, sort of reflect back her understanding of what he was saying, kind of just changed their whole, relationship for the day.
That's, I think, a very encouraging finding, because you might, in the absence of findings like that, think, well, maybe both of the participants in the interaction, it may be necessary for both of them to have had that empathy circle training for it to work. But what that suggests is that no, it's sufficient that one of them knows how to use the technique. It's sort of analogous to an agreeable person being able to have a pleasant interaction with a disagreeable person. What the agreeable person is doing works so well to keep the interaction at a pleasant, upbeat level that it's almost as if the personality of the disagreeable person is essentially undermined, or maybe it's more appropriate to say overwhelmed by the positive things that the agreeable person is doing. I think it's a very encouraging direction to study whether a person who's been trained in your empathy circle technique can essentially produce a socially engineered desirable effect interacting with all kinds of other people, even highly defensive ones or ones that have a completely opposite initial mindset.
There's another aspect that just came to mind is that it seems like we as human beings have a need to be heard and seen. So in those situations, I mean, I hear this often. People are the ones that do the listening in their family, so they listen to to members of their family, but the family members don't listen in return. And then then they start getting frustrated, like, oh, I'm doing all the listening, but the others aren't listening to me. And what I found is that there's sort of this need. It's almost like an empathy battery that we need to have our to be heard, and that sort of charges us, uh, sort of, and that if you go to an empathy circle with other people where you're heard, that when you go back to those environments that don't listen to you, you have sort of more capacity to listen to people, even when they're not listening to you. So just a thought that came to mind, how it and I find the same thing, that I go into these environments to do mediation, people aren't really listening to me and it's very stressful. But by having a group where I'm heard and have a chance to sort of vent and share any anxieties in an empathic space, sort of gives me capacity to go into these environments, which are, I would say, low empathy environments, and give me the sort of the resources to be able to listen to others who are maybe not listening back.
Well, I hope that's true. Um, I do hope it's true. I get the sense from the example you use that sometimes people, like in their own family situation, if they have the capacity to listen, but family members don't, I've seen those kinds of exchanges and been a part of them on more than one occasion. And often they take the form of one person protests and says, "You're not listening," and the other person seems to have already made up their mind about what the first person was thinking or feeling. And there's really no justification for making me devote additional effort to listening when I already know who
Mm.
you are and what you're about. Of course, that's got to be really frustrating for the person who hasn't been listened to, and tries to get listened to, and the partner just kind of dismisses it like, I already know you. Why are you trying to change my mind about who you are? I know you already.
Yes, you had a lot of other findings that you had about different about empathy within friends, within relationships. So, want to share some of the other findings that you came
Well,
found?
we when we had this method for measuring empathic accuracy, um, it was like a tool we could use to open up avenues of research. And what questions do you start with? Well, like a lot of people, we started with simple, basic questions, developed hypotheses that we felt almost had to be true, but until we'd done an empathic accuracy study and found that they were indeed true, it would remain an open question whether the method for assessing empathic accuracy could pick up the differences we were predicting. So yeah, we predicted on the basis of common sense that close friends ought to be more empathically accurate than strangers. So we did a study where we had pairs of same-sex strangers, college age, two young women, two young men. We brought them to the lab. In half the cases, they were friends who had known each other for at least a year and considered themselves to be close or even best friends. The other half of the pairs that we brought in were two males, two females who were complete strangers when we recorded their interaction. And then we had them, after the interaction was over, go to separate cubicles, report all their thoughts and feelings during the interaction. And then they traded tapes so that now you're watching the tape of the interaction and you're getting the tape stopped at the point where the other person reported all their thoughts and feelings, and you're making your inferences about what the other person's thoughts and feelings were. And as we expected, we found that the friends were indeed more accurate in reading or inferring each other's thoughts and feelings than the strangers were. Um, One way to explain that might simply be, well, maybe the friends simply had more to say to each other, and so they were exchanging more information, and with more information, they could more accurately infer each other's thoughts and feelings. That turned out not to be what was going on. It wasn't just the amount of information, it was the kind of information. Friends had a long history of talking to each other, sharing their opinions about different things, learning about each other's preferences, attitudes, values. And it was that storehouse of information that they'd acquired in the past, which seemed to be really important in making the friends more accurate in inferring each other's thoughts and feelings.
There's another aspect too. Is like in terms of the relationship, how the relationship goes more deeper, it becomes more deeply empathic. And I'm hearing that, as friends, maybe have that over time have developed that depth. There's another part is how people speak too. I wonder if you looked at that, because what I find is in the empathy circle, someone who's very sort of intellectual, they can sort of detach from what it is that's going on in their bodies. That it's harder to follow them in terms of because they're not really expressing their felt experience, and it's those people who speak more about they share what their own felt experience. It's easier to connect with them, and I think that ties in. Or if you looked at the work of Gene Gendlin, he worked with Rogers, and he did a study of he was looking at um, who how does growth happen in therapy. There's people who go into therapy, nothing happens for them, and it doesn't go anywhere, and others grow and learn and kind of move through kind of different issues. And he looked at a lot of different therapeutic processes, and what he found was it was how the person spoke that kind of really was a major factor in terms of how they had growth in the therapeutic process. And it was people who spoke about a felt experience, and especially were sort of at the edge of what their feelings were. Like, you look at you express a felt experience, and then there's other feelings that are sort of vague underneath that. And by staying with those vagueness and the feelings that are underneath there, that was sort of people who stayed sort of in that state were the ones that had the most growth. So I'm kind of looking at that with the empathy circle, like how do we deepen the empathic connection with each other? So, if empathy is sensing into the experience of someone else, the more the speaker is open and sort of transparent, the deeper the empathic connection can be. So so I'm kind of interested in sort of that aspect of deepening the empathic connection.
In our research, we have found that there are big differences in how readable different people are, how readable their thoughts and feelings are. And there are some people who hold their cards very close to their vest. They don't let their feelings get expressed in what they say or how they say it. And other people wear their hearts on their sleeves, so to speak. They freely talk about their feelings and make what's inside available to people who they're talking to. So it's a very important variable. We found that the target's readability in general is more important than the perceiver's empathic ability in determining empathic accuracy scores, which is another way of saying that um, although all perceivers might be trying to infer accurately other people's thoughts and feelings, their ability counts for less in the long run than how readable the people are whose thoughts and feelings they're trying to infer.
Yeah, any more insights about that? I mean, that's big. That it's about you as the speaker, sharing your how you share your experience is going to help the relationship.
Well, in everyday life, things are really complicated. And I'm not saying that it's not complicated in a therapy situation or in your empathy circle, but in real life, people have all kinds of motives they bring to interactions. And some of the motives are exploitative, selfish, manipulative. In situations like that, you probably often are not getting the cues, the information that you would need to accurately infer the other person's thoughts and feelings. If they're trying to successfully manipulate you or to hoodwink you, um, they may have spent a lot of time practicing, leading you to believe that they think one way or feel a certain way when in fact something else is going on entirely. The nice thing about the therapeutic relationship or your empathy circle relationships is that people are making a genuine and honest effort to be accurate in expressing the feelings they really have, be non-defensive, not trying to hide thoughts and feelings, to not be deceptive, present false thoughts and feelings. So it's messier in the real world, and I think we have to work in these settings where, like with your empathy circle, people can agree on the ground rules and do their best to follow them.
Yeah, that's a big part of it is that agreement. And then I think having that agreement also builds trust that if you're in an environment where you're going to be heard, you're not going to have to compete. Usually when people get together, a group gets together, there's a couple people that sort of dominate, the conversation, do most of the speaking, and a lot of people are just kind of pull back, kind of withdraw. And in the empathy circle, you don't have to compete to be heard. And I think that kind of helps build trust, and that trust leads to more openness and transparency too over time. I think that's like
And trust
another
is
benefit.
also very much affected by your experience of when you share your actual thought or feeling. What response do you get? Do people make fun of you for expressing your actual thought or feeling? Do they act dismissive, like you shouldn't think that or you shouldn't feel that? If your own thoughts and feelings are not respected by the other person, chances are pretty good you're just going to keep them to yourself. You're going to try to mask or disguise them. Uh, and that really defeats the point of what you're trying to do in the empathy circle. But it's something that has to be reckoned with in everyday life when these these attempts to communicate, to be empathic, to be understood, and to understand others can get undermined by these kinds of factors.
Well, the empathy circle I find is one of the structure that kind of helps hold sort of that empathic way of being, that mutual empathy, or I actually see it as holistic empathy in terms of definitions. In that you know that when you speak, whatever you say will be, the person will share, they will reflect back, actively listen to what you say. So they won't, judge, they won't, all those things you're talking about, that they'll just, you're kind of like guaranteed to be heard and understood. And that kind of helps just know that that's going to happen. Just, I think, builds trust, and the barriers go down. And one thing I was just thinking about is with Rogers, this is kind of about the definition of empathy too, because usually empathy, it seems to me, is defined as, one from an individualistic point of view, where one person is empathizing with another person. And so in the case of the therapeutic situation, you had the therapist listening to the client, and it's a one-way empathy, primary direction of the client and therapist. And what we're trying to do is bring it into mutual empathy. So there is no, one person who's outside of the circle. Everyone is listening to everyone else in the circle. So there's no person sort of outside of that space like the therapist is. And that sort of, I'm kind of curious about this in terms of definition of empathy, because I'm seeing there's, in terms of the definition, that there's a holistic empathy. So in the empathy circle, you have four people, and sort of a true or a holistic empathy is when all parties are empathizing with each other. So it's like an empathic space, a mutual empathy. And I see that empathy, uh, primarily gets defined in sort of an individualistic definition of one person empathizing with another, versus seeing sort of a holistic empathy, and having that difference. I think if I've noticed there's a lot of criticisms of empathy, and a lot. For example, uh, there's a book coming out called "Suicidal Empathy," and their criticism is that progressives empathize with immigrants coming across illegally across the border, but they're not empathizing with other people who are being impacted by that. And I think there's a point to that, that a holistic empathy would be, the community empathizing with immigrants, but immigrants also empathizing with, people in the country, and everybody sort of empathizing with each other in this holistic way. And so I don't know. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? This sort of relational, holistic empathy versus sort of an individual definition of empathy.
Well, I want to react to the last of your points that in some ideal society, everybody would be fully aware of everybody else's perspective and see why, from that perspective, that person's values, beliefs, attitudes, thoughts, and feelings are coherent and make sense. But that's an awful lot to ask of people. And even adults, it's an awful lot to ask where we can pay attention to every potential party and adopt their perspective in succession and somehow come up with a picture or a take on the situation that's fair and just to everyone there. Let me give you a simple example. They're doing some road repair near where I live, and what that did was it funneled all the traffic into a single lane at a very busy intersection. Now, on this street where the road work's being done, there are restaurants where people are going in to eat and they want to get back into that traffic flow. But now there's a line of cars that's been waiting for several minutes for a light so that they can move. The people in the restaurants just off that street, they want to get into the traffic flow immediately. And some people think, well, I'll be nice. I will create a gap here and let that person in. That sounds like they're being empathic and they're taking this individual's perspective into account. But are they really giving enough weight to the perspective of the 30 people lined up behind them who've been waiting a lot longer? You know, if you let somebody into the traffic flow, that makes it sound like you're a nice person, but did you ever consider that you should get the permission of all those people behind you who've been waiting a lot longer than the person who just finished eating and now wants to immediately get into the traffic flow? It just doesn't. You can see the problem here. You not only have to take different people's personalities or perspectives rather into account, you also have to take into account the context. Is it fair that just because this person's ready to go, I have to keep the people behind me waiting even longer than they already have?
Yeah, so it's so if you have, well, the empathy circle sort of creates a context for doing that. So we'll have people in conflict, and you can bring in all the parties who are in the conflict, and they can have an empathy circle to kind of discuss it. And then you have this situation you're describing. So you have all the stakeholders. You've got the 30 people in the car behind you. You've got the driver who's pausing. You have the driver who's wanting to, get, coming from the restaurant. So there's a lot of stakeholders that all their sort of concerns and needs and need to be heard in a purely ideal empathic environment, right? People would have a chance to voice those. And I think that is part of what democracy is about, saying that, we as a democracy can work out these issues through dialogue, ideally, and sort of a mutual empathy. And sometimes it's just not practical to be able to have everybody come into that circle, but having more environments where that is possible, like teaching the mindset in the schools, the community. There's someone that does these community uh, events, something like if there's going to be this parking, this situation that you're talking about, you have the restaurant, someone from the restaurant, you have some of the local community, you have the public works department. They get together and they have these dialogues to kind of hear everyone's concern, to kind of try to work out issues in advance. And so bringing everybody together in one big empathy circles, maybe not practical, but still the sort of the direction sort of is an ideal. And how do we sort of move, at least move in that direction versus sort of a top down, let's say authoritarian sort of, this is how we're going to do it approach.
Well, if you see these kinds of situations develop in highways, there's often somebody with like a flagman or even a traffic cop, and they let all the traffic going a certain direction go for a certain length of time, so X number of cars moves through. It's not fair that even though there's a ton more cars behind them, that those people all have to clear out completely before the side traffic comes in. So the traffic cop may time it, or at least attempt to time it, and make sure that everybody's got an equal opportunity to move, and nobody's advantaged where they get to move right away and other people have to wait for several minutes. It's the kind of thing that you shouldn't have to collect information from each individual participant. You just make sure that in the aggregate, people going both directions are treated fairly, or at least following the same procedure.
Yeah, so they already had gone through these. Public Works probably already had done studies and try to find the best, most efficient solution to that problem.
If you
In
can
that
automate
case,
it, that's probably the best you can do.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The other,
But
go ahead.
I noticed one thing in the most recent presidential election. The Republicans ran an ad, and when I saw it, I said, as somebody who used to study advertising techniques, I said that ad was brilliant. I said it's probably going to be the single um, most effective ad against the Harris Waltz ticket. And it was an ad that concluded with the lines, Harris and Waltz are for they and them. Trump and Vance are for me and you.
Mm.
And the idea was that they and them were people like transsexuals or people who had a sexual orientation or gender identity that's different from the norm, and they're very much in a minority. Um, I think that that was a hugely influential ad because it gave the impression that the Democrats were not just concerned about minority rights, but had carried this overboard to the point where they take the perspectives and the thoughts and feelings of a very tiny percentage of people and they amplify them so that they appear in the minds of the electorate to be just obsessively focused on this tiny group and ignoring just about everybody else. Now, that may be an unfair characterization, but I think that was the effect that the ad had. And it was essentially saying, not at an individual level, but at a group level, some groups deserve all this extra focus of attention, having their thoughts and feelings weighted very heavily. And I think that what why the ad worked was it created a sense of disproportionate
Mm.
um, or privileging the thoughts and feelings of a few at the expense of the many.
Yeah, that's what we try to work with in the empathy circle. That you're not weighing any one group. That there's a sense of fairness and equality. That you get a voice too. Um, so I think that's important, for any sort of policies to make sure everyone feels like they've had a voice. And I think the empathy circle helps at the core. And we also have free speech in the empathy circle. It's like say whatever you want, and whatever you say will be met empathically. And I find that sort of slowly transforms the conversation. Makes it more real, or kind of goes deeper.
I guess the point I'm making is people don't have a problem with other people having a voice. Where they draw the line and where they have the problem is if a very tiny but highly vocal group gets listened to a lot, and the vast majority of people, by comparison, get listened to less.
Yeah.
So it's not just making sure that everybody has a voice. It's how much of a voice does each
Mm.
person or each group have, and is it disproportionate or is it fair to everyone?
Yeah, with again, I use the empathy circle as a model. So in the empathy circle, everyone gets 5 minutes to speak and get reflection, and then it goes around and people get multiple turns. So it takes away that part where just one person, even if they're in distress, sometimes somebody's in the empathy circle and they have a lot of distress, but they get just equal time with everyone else. So I think that's important. I mean, and what you're saying is people inherently they don't like when just one group gets more of a voice disproportionately than others.
They see them as being singled out for special attention or special considerations.
Yeah. Well, that's again the empathy circle. I think sort of models that giving sort of equal voice to everyone. Yeah. You know.
I would love to see what happens if there was a generation of kids who went through public school participating in empathy circles, not just in one semester, but in repeated semesters, and then they develop that as a life skill, as a toolkit for seeking feedback from people in everyday life, parents, people in the community, people at their age level, older people, where they felt confident of their ability based on this kind of experience to say, here, when you said that, I thought maybe you meant this. Is that right? Um, or it seemed to me that you got a little bit angry at that point. Were you really angry when you were saying that? What was it you were feeling? It sounds simple enough, and it is simple enough in conception to say we all ought to have that tool, and we ought to be able to use it in any situation um, without causing offense or people feeling like it's non-normative. But I think, and it is non-normative now in our society. But I think if you could somehow get people trained to do that very young and let them carry it through in their lives outside of the empathy circle, we could transform society potentially.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and that's what we're working on. That's really our mission is to do that. I've been looking for a school. We'd like to have a school where we could have all the students, teachers, staff would learn how to take part in an empathy circle as a sort of a model of what would happen. I think it would be a good, if you know any graduate students or others who want to do a research program project, that would be, I think, a great project to show what the effect is, on the school culture, and that um, and one thing we do, like with the empathy circle, I find is we do the empathy circle and you kind of practice this. And then when you have conversations, that sort of that mindset, when you're just talking to people, that same mindset is still there. And then when we have, let's say, and then if you're in a relationship and you have some problems come up, we say, well, then go back to the empathy circle. Like a conflict starts happening. So and I've done that with my nephews and nieces, where they would, they're like 5, 6 years old. They get in a conflict, and I sit down and I listen to each of them, actively listen, and then I have them do active listening with each other, and then they actually work out their problems. And then sometimes I hear they have a conflict comes up, and I say, "Oh, you've got a conflict. What do we do?" And they say, "We have an empathy circle." So it's like kind of, so you have that as a fallback too, like in a school. If everyone learned the practice, I think it would shift the mindset. And then you also have a fallback that if conflict does happen, you have some tools for working those out. Yeah.
Some people, though, we have to acknowledge, are reticent. They don't like to share themselves. They don't like to necessarily provide accurate information about what's going on with them, their thoughts and feelings. And if somebody tries to get that information from them, however diplomatically, however much experience they've had successfully getting that kind of information and questioning others and getting feedback about their inferences of those individuals' thoughts and feelings, some people may be very reactive to that and say, stay out of my head. Why are you asking me these questions
Hmm.
about my thoughts and feelings? They're mine, they're private, they don't belong to you. And there are cultural differences that apply here as well. When we first started doing our empathic accuracy research many years ago at the University of Wisconsin, and then later at the University of Texas at Arlington, we would find that we'd have people participating in these pairs in the laboratory as strangers And at the end of the session, we would find that there were individuals that wouldn't report their thoughts and feelings. They wouldn't write them down for us in the form of a sentence. Or we might find that they came up with one, but the rest of the rest of the time they didn't come up with any. It turned out that what we observed over and over again, and this was probably a product of the time. I'm sure it's somewhat different now, but this was back in the 1970s, early 1980s. These instances often involved international students from Asian countries. At first, I thought, well, maybe they don't understand what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to go through to view the videotape of the interaction they were just in. They're supposed to pause the videotape. And then at each of the points where they had a thought or feeling, they're supposed to write out the content of the thought or feeling. So I would talk to the students who weren't coming up with these thoughts and feelings, who weren't reporting them, and I'd say, did you understand that that was your task and how you were supposed to do it? They understood all that perfectly. And I said, well, why didn't you write down any thoughts and feelings? And they seemed to have a reason, but they were reluctant to share it. And I had to get a little bit pushy, a little bit assertive, and saying, it really would help us, since we're trying to develop this research technique, to know why you weren't forthcoming with your thoughts and feelings. Finally, when I pushed them, I started getting answers like, I came here from Hong Kong. People live in constant interaction with other people, mostly strangers. People are all around you all the time. There's no privacy to speak of except in your own mind. And so our cultural norm is the one thing that you're allowed to and even encouraged to keep completely to yourself is your own thoughts and feelings. You have no obligation to share them, and it's rude for somebody to ask for them. So by the cultural standards that applied to those students at that time, we were incredibly insensitive. We were asking them to report their thoughts and feelings from this interaction they were just in. And that wasn't at all their cultural experience. And we were the rude people who were insensitive to their cultural standards.
Yeah, so different cultures have different levels of sharing. Then, so you have to be
If you
sensitive to
tried to
that.
introduce the quality circle concept in, say, Hong Kong back in those days, it would have been a real challenge, I would expect.
Yeah, the um, we that empathy tent that I was telling you about, we take that out to public spaces and just offer active listening to people just out on the street. So I'm in Berkeley and in Santa Barbara, kind of between the two places, and we'd taken it to UC Berkeley, Sproul Plaza, offered listening. And just a couple of months ago, we were at UC Santa Barbara, and we set up you know, we just set up a bunch of chairs. We had a group of people doing listening, and students could come by and sit down. And I just remember someone from China, a woman from China came, and a student from China came, and she was actually very open. She talked about her mental illness and all the stuff she was going through. She shared how her parents are paying for her schooling, and she needed therapy, and therapy was helpful, but it was too expensive, and she felt bad about her parents having and paying for it, so she stopped. And anyway, it could be, yeah. So anyway, I was just in terms of that same culture, there's probably differences in that culture too. And he was very
I think things
interested.
I think things have changed over
Hmm.
time. I think that this reticence that we observed back in the 1980s is probably not there to the same extent, probably much reduced, in the year 2024.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, yeah. Another thing that I just had that I did want to ask you about in terms of definitions of empathy, and I saw it in some of your work. Was there's when you look at the current definitions, a common definition is that there's affective and cognitive empathy, and I find those terms not very helpful. I think that the cognitive and affective, emotional and thought are so intertwined. It's hard to really differentiate those two. I just wondered what you think about those terms. You
Well,
seemed like in one of the video audio interviews of you, it seemed like you had a little bit of skepticism about that too.
well, actually, I would say based on our experience, which involves roughly 20 years of doing these kinds of studies and looking at hundreds of interactions between pairs of individuals, one of the things we found was that people have virtually no difficulty distinguishing their own thoughts from their own feelings. So when we would have them pause the tape and write down the thought or feeling, they had two options. They had a thought box that they could choose to report a thought, and they had a feeling box that they could choose to report a feeling. Now, if they had both a thought and a feeling, they were free to use both boxes. But people almost never told us that they had any trouble deciding whether what they were reporting was a thought or a feeling. It was an easy distinction for them to make. Now, occasionally, this, what they're reporting is both a thought and a feeling, but the vast majority of reports were of things that they considered to be only a thought or only a feeling, not something that was both. Um,
Mhm.
but you're right. We didn't make a big deal of that in terms of, are people more accurate in inferring each other's thoughts or each other's feelings, because the research was showing that they were really pretty similar in their accuracy for thoughts versus feelings.
Yeah, when someone is speaking and sharing, and you're reflecting back, it seems like it's the thoughts and feelings, or at least at least for me, are so intertwined that it might, maybe, yeah. And in fact, I mean, it seems to me that thoughts have a feeling. That if you have a thought, that there is a felt experience associated with the thought, if that makes sense. That if you go deep enough into a thought, you can start sensing the various feelings that make up that thought. Does
Well,
that
there's
make
an
sense?
awful lot of just factual statements that people make.
Mhm.
It's not just teachers who are trying to convey course material that speak very matter of factly and report on facts. We do it. We do it at work, no matter
Mhm.
what our occupation is. We answer questions that people ask us, like what what part of the building is this agency in? So it's the case that there are an awful lot of thoughts that we report that really don't have emotional content associated with them. But you're right,
Mhm.
there are ones where it is hard to separate the emotional content from the factual statement or the thought component.
Yeah, that seems to be the. Do you know how that those definitions got formed? I mean, you've been doing this a long time. Have you seen that evolution of the definition of empathy? The cognitive and affective empathy model.
I didn't feel like I really began to understand what the term empathy meant until I found something really old in the literature. Back in 1929, a German philosopher named Max Scheler, Scheler, in German distinguished different types of experiences in which the thoughts and feelings of a perceiver reflect what's going on in somebody that they're perceiving. And empathy is only one of those states. Taylor listed a bunch of others. We didn't have English equivalents for most of them until a sociologist named Howard Becker, who was, I guess, fluent in German, worked to try to transfer or translate Becker's distinctions into English. And so Becker did a good job, I think, of distinguishing empathy from things like sympathy,
Mm-hmm.
or empathy from what Becker called, or what Shaler called, compathy. Compathy would be just feeling the same feeling at the same time another person is having the feeling. A husband and a wife are standing at the graveside of their deceased son. They're having the same feeling at the same time because of the situation and its common effect on them. That's different from them actively trying to figure out what's going on in the other person's mind. There's no need to do that because the situation guarantees that they're feeling the same thing at the same time. Um, Taylor also translated one of these states as empathy,
Mm-hmm.
where suppose you're watching a person in the circus who's walking on a wire, and you see the person flinch, and you automatically flinch. That's not something that you're consciously trying to cognize. It's an automatic response to a behavior that has a meaning to you. This person felt on the edge of peril. There's a moment of panic there, and you flinch and react to it without consciously trying to process. You don't need to do that. So when I found that, I found it very helpful. I describe Shaler's distinctions in my book, Everyday Mind Reading, and I talked about how empathy, if you think about a multidimensional space in which these different forms of reactions to other people's experience occur, empathy is right in the middle. It's in the center. And so it's in an ideal position to get confused with all of these other states, which Shaler was so careful to distinguish from empathy. And so empathy became a kind of a Rorschach word after a while, not long after it was introduced. Um, Theodore Reich, for example, in the 1940s said that empathy has so many different meanings now that it doesn't have any meaning at all. It does, it's just that we haven't done as good a job as we need to do of recognizing that empathy is different from sympathy, it's different from compathy, it's different from mympathy, different from unipathy. I know these terms don't make much sense because they're the equivalent of terms that otherwise would not exist in English since they were originally in the German. But I think you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
We need to do a better job of doing a very rigorous, systematic, even philosophical analysis of these states and make fine distinctions among them. I think that a lot of the theorizing, as you're hinting, has been kind of crude and even careless.
Yeah, that's I'm thinking of even doing a book on defining empathy. Like I had talked to Dan Batson. He says, it you pretty much have to just lay out your definition of empathy and sort of stick with it, and be clear about how you're defining it. So I did want to really articulate how I'm seeing empathy, but put it into the context of an empathy circle, so that whatever aspect of those different terms you were using, that we can actually role play those in an empathy circle so that you can experience it. For example, you might have heard of the book Against Empathy by Paul Bloom. If you're familiar with that one.
I haven't read the book, but I am familiar with the
Okay.
title. Yeah.
So, I had talked to him, had the email exchange with him, and I just couldn't figure out what his uh, criticisms of empathy work. And then finally, there was something he wrote. He said it's like you go to a therapist, you're totally upset, you're totally angry, and then your therapist gets angry too. And that's that compathy, I think you were just saying, right? Or is that it's sort of a state matching. He was defining
Uh-huh.
empathy as you get you're angry, and then your therapist gets angry, which I think is actually a block to empathy. So I think it's that term compathy that you were using, isn't that?
That might be the closest
Mm,
term from Shaler's list, or in terms of what people in the English-speaking tradition have used. Probably they'd call it emotional contagion.
mm-hmm. State matching,
Yeah,
emotional contagion. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, so we can role play that in an empathy circle where there's people that the speaker has that emotion, and then you as the listener, instead of reflecting back, the speaker says, "Oh, I'm totally angry." Then the speaker, and the listener says, "Yeah, I'm totally angry too." And you can sense the difference between that and then the listener saying, "Oh, I understand that you're feeling angry," and then
Mm-hmm.
staying present with the speaker. So it's almost like the eye of a needle. There's so many different other experiences around empathy that it can get confused with, and the same with sympathy, in the sense that if I and the speaker talk about really a struggle I'm having, I feel really down. That you, instead of reflecting back I'm hearing you're having this struggle and you're feeling down, sort of staying present with me, that you start saying, "Oh, I feel so sorry for you," or sort of a more of a sympathetic, which is all, so to be able to experience the difference in the quality of empathic reflection, presence, and these other subtle, feelings or approaches.
Sometimes feeling the same thing, or what you suspect and believe is exactly the same thing that, say, a client in therapy is feeling, may help you connect better with the client's experience, may help you be a more sensitive, effective therapist, but it may, in some cases, just derail you. Maybe what you need is to be objective and to have a separation between yourself and the client, and not let the client's feeling overwhelm your analysis of the client's situation and what what the elements of it are. Sometimes it might be helpful, sometimes it might not, to try to share the client's feeling at a given moment.
Yeah, in terms of that sharing of the client or the other person's feeling, the way I look at it is the person has a feeling, and I'm sensing into that feeling, but I'm not sort of like overwhelmed with it. I'm still
Mm-hmm.
present, and I can listen to the feeling, and I can start hearing what's sort of behind the feeling.
And you can
Uh,
be more objective. You can say
mm,
the feeling doesn't have to flood everything. The feeling doesn't have to overwhelm everything. Let's put the feeling in perspective with other things that are going on in the situation, in the client's situation, that may be just as important or even more important.
yeah, and that can actually be helpful because it keeps the person from being sort of overwhelmed themselves when they hear someone else, hear them. So I think that's maybe one of the healing aspects of it, just to know, one, that there's somebody else there, so you have that sense of connection with someone else, and that's sort of very supportive, and also maybe that sense of perspective, or yeah, where it's not like all one feeling overwhelming you. So anyway,
Imagine that you have clients that come in and they catastrophize. Everything is blown up. It's huge. It's larger than life. You could quickly see that it might not be particularly helpful, clients like that, for you to co-catastrophize
mhm.
along with them, and make all these small problems seem huge and unsurmountable. What would probably increase your effectiveness as a therapist is to say, wait a minute, is that big reaction really justified to something that most people would decide is pretty small and insignificant in the scheme of things? And I think Freud was concerned about that from the very beginning, that the therapist would get caught up in the patient's emotions and that would be less effective in helping the patient put those emotions in a realistic perspective.
Yeah. Well, that's where the empathy circle helps too, by having four people in the circle. I find is that you have multiple points of view that empathic points of view. So if somebody is catastrophizing and the listener is reflecting back, but then the listener also gets a chance to speak, and their views, their feelings, their thoughts get shared with someone else. So you create a space where there's multiple people sharing, and and yes, and there's sort of more of an empathic, mutual empathic space, so that person that's catastrophizing doesn't fill the whole space.
And some of the other people say, well, it's a big deal to you, but it's never been a big deal to me. And I've
Mm-hmm.
gotten along just fine without blowing this up and making it a big emotional event. It suggests, that your experience is not invalid. It's valid for you, but it's not the only experience people have in situations like yours. And you might actually adapt and perform better if you didn't catastrophize.
Yeah, so it helps maybe put that into context for that person. So you're retired now from your studies. Are you still doing work in this area, or
I'm retired. I've been retired since about 2021, so it's been roughly 3 years.
are you still doing kind of studies in your retirement, or what's your interest now?
In 2005, I had an invitation to go to Belgium and spread the word about our empathic accuracy research. My wife went with me. It was a wonderful experience. We we organized a series of conferences throughout Belgium. People came and presented their work and their ideas, and the goal was, when I left, have planted the seeds for different lines of empathic accuracy research to be done by people in that part of the world, and it pretty much worked, particularly at Ghent University in northern Belgium. And that group has, as they've continued to do empathic accuracy studies, occasionally, in fact, fairly often, given me a chance to participate.
Hmm.
Not in collecting the data or analyzing the data, but participate as one of their co-authors and make contributions to manuscripts and help revise for publication. So I've kind of kept a hand in that way, but I'm not on my own collecting data actively now. And although it was wonderful to have a research career that extended over decades, it's been easier than I would have thought to scale it back and maybe even see it come to an end.
Well, I started in this on this topic of empathy. Got interested about 15 years ago, and your work was sort of seminal work. Uh, back when I first got started. So.
I think it's a little bit ironic, as I sort of hinted earlier, that it was wanting to study social interaction between strangers and wanting to figure out what are all the behaviors they display, coming at it from a strictly methodological point of view. And then once we figured out how to measure various observable interaction behaviors, getting kind of greedy and saying, well, can we get more information from these videotaped interactions than how much they looked, how much they smiled, how much they gestured? And then we came up with a way to look at the thoughts and feelings they were having. And then that led eventually to, well, what if we assess how well they can figure out each other's thoughts and feelings? My point is that I didn't start by intending to be an empathy researcher
Mhm.
or an empathic accuracy researcher. The methods that we've been developing over the course of 10 years led me there. And then I said, oh, we can do it. We can study empathy this way. Might as well try. And the research turned me into an empathy researcher. It wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
pre-existing goal that I had. So, so in a way, I feel like there's something slightly fraudulent about how I came to be an empathy researcher. I was a person who was kind of obsessed with methodology, and and by following where the methodology led us, we wound up studying empathy.
Well, following that, that's kind of that's how it happened for me too. I didn't think I was going to be getting into this empathy work years ago. It's just you kind of follow your interests, you follow the data, and it just kind of leads you somewhere. It's kind of interesting.
And then you realize, well, okay, I got to a place in my research interest where other people started, and it took me 10 years to get there, but that doesn't mean that my experience as a researcher is any less valid or interesting than theirs.
Well, what we're looking at is, how do we spread this empathy, as a cultural value? And, you were saying if we can get empathy circles and trainings into the schools, I think, it's a foundational value that can really improve cultural, societal well-being, personal well-being. So that's what
It's a
I've
big
done.
challenge, and I think you may be aware of this, but I imagine there are many of your listeners that don't know about how in the early 1970s at the University of Texas in Austin, where I was a graduate student, one of my mentors, Elliot Aronson, was contacted by representatives of Austin Public Schools to help with the problem of racial tension in the schools following integration. Suddenly, classrooms were integrated when they hadn't been before, and there was a real concern that minority students who were placed in classrooms where a lot of their new peers were the majority Anglo American students who may have had educational advantages that the minority students didn't have, they would be automatically second class citizens in these newly integrated classrooms. Well, Aronson and his team came up with the concept of the jigsaw classroom, where the students taught each other
Mm.
instead of the teacher doing all the teaching. The students were responsible for learning, each of them, a different part of the course material. And then, in something very like your quality circles, a group of 4 or 5, which would have a majority student, white Anglo student, maybe a Mexican American student, an African American student, an Asian American student. They would take turns teaching each other their part of the material. Well, the students had better self esteem.
Mm.
Those who were from minority groups, because they realized I'm making essentially an equal contribution compared to everybody else. Their grades did not decline following being in these newly integrated classrooms. They went up. There have been tons and tons of studies all over the country that have validated the effectiveness of this jigsaw classroom concept. And yet, because it's not the traditional way of doing things, even though the data are overwhelming, it's been really hard to convince school boards. You can do slideshow demonstrations, present them with all kinds of journal article data showing that this works. People are stuck in their traditional views of
Mm-hmm.
how education should proceed. Um, I think that the jigsaw puzzle concept, if it had been widely implemented across the country, going back to when it was first introduced in the 1970s, over the last 50 years, might have just absolutely transformed the landscape in this country. Not eliminate all prejudice, all forms of discrimination, but reduce it a lot. By the same token, I think your quality circle idea, if it was widely used and adopted in public schools, could transform an entire generation of people, and not just them, but how they raise their kids and how those kids raise theirs. Uh, the problem is you introduce something that new and different, met by not reasoned opposition, but just kind of an unthinking, we've never done it that way before.
Yeah, well, I feel that like you, I'm pretty enthusiastic about it. I think it can have a real benefit, and doing whatever I can to move that forward. And I think other people can build on it. It's like I feel like I've kind of done my part. I've contributed as much as I can, and future generations can pick up on it, and hopefully we can have more effect. I'd love to get some studies done. If you know of any, like I said, any researchers or grad students who want to do a PhD on the empathy circle, or to get more studies on it.
At this point in my career, I'm not training graduate students, but
Mhm.
it seems like something that a lot of graduate students would get excited about.
Yeah, well, we're trying to get it out there. Kind of spread the word. We have uh, empathy summits where we have speakers who have taken part in empathy circles where they can talk about their experiences and their insights. So yeah, we're pretty dedicated to it. There's also the empathy tent, which we haven't really done too much of since COVID, but we would go out to knock down, drag out political rallies. Like a lot of the right wing would come to Berkeley after Trump was elected, to demonstrate here. And then it'd be counter demonstrations with Antifa and so forth. And it'd be maybe 5 of us in the empathy tent offering to actively listen to both sides and help support them in listening to each other.
Were those
And
sessions videotaped?
they were. I can send you a video of it. There's a documentary called Trump Phobia, What Both Sides Fear. And it was a filmmaker. She was traveling around the country videotaping all these different demonstrations. And she came to Berkeley, saw our empathy tent, got really excited, did an interview with us and videotaped what we were doing, and then invited us down to LA where there was a impeach Trump rally. And we took the empathy tent down there, set up in the Los Angeles City Hall on their lawn. And there was these big demonstrations. On the other side of the street was the pro-Trump and anti-Trump folks screaming and yelling. And we would bring one person from each side into the empathy tent, and I would sort of have them do an empathy circle. And during the day we did 5 pairs. I mean, we did 6 pairs of from each side, and 5 of them ended up 5 pairs ended up giving each other hugs at the end. And I've got it on video. I'll send you a link to that part of the video. So
Please
it
do.
is, yeah.
What I'm wondering now, and we're living at a time when it's getting harder and harder in some cases to distinguish between documentaries and feature films. But if you were to routinely videotape these kinds of encounters in the empathy tent,
Hmm.
I bet that it would be possible to attract a feature filmmaker to come in and use those as source material for creating a very dramatic feature film where professional actors may actually
Mm-hmm.
repeat the very lines, the very sentiments that were expressed by the people in your empathy tent, and produce an hour and a half, 2 hour movie that offers some of the most dramatic examples of, of what you're talking about. People who would start out by yelling at each other from their respective camps, not make any progress in mutual understanding, pulling them into the empathy tent, and by the end of it, you're seeing the tears, you're seeing the
Mm-hmm.
hugs, you're
Yeah.
seeing the reconciliation of two human beings who were apparently at the beginning just completely opposed and irreconcilable.
Yeah, that we do need a film, a couple like that could have a huge impact, something like that. So we do have someone
If you're
who's
since you're based in California, it's kind of natural to float that idea and see who picks up on it.
yeah, we do have a film like someone who's been studying film. He's still young though, and he's trying to get into do a graduate program, in the UCLA or New York. So he's really interested in that, and he just sent off his applications, and I gave him a recommendation and just said how he was enthusiastic about, creating films about empathy. So, uh, yeah. So,
Well, you could provide, if you routinely videotape these encounters in the empathy tent, you could provide lots and lots of these previously taped encounters as source material that people could draw from. They'd have to get uh, some degree of creative license
hmm.
in picking and choosing what they wanted to present in their feature film. But you could have actors who are good at conveying strong emotions.
Right.
You have writers who are really good at picking the most dramatic moments and integrating them so that there's a building of the effect from the beginning of the film to the end. But that could be something super powerful
Yeah.
that a lot of people would see, as opposed to just a relative few who are interested in a documentary of this sort.
Right. Feature film with actors, and you're just really seeing it. Yeah, that would be. I mean, the empathy
Now they,
tent is so powerful because the most media we got was for the empathy tent work. Like it was on Fox and Friends, on Breitbart, on Sacramento Bee, L.A. Times, the TV stations here in the Bay Area all sort of mentioned it, in one way or another. So it really gets a lot of publicity.
well, think about the effect it would have if it was a feature film based
Yeah.
on your empathy tent sessions that wound up on Netflix
Hmm.
or
Yeah, that'd be
or
powerful.
Amazon Prime, where you have hundreds of millions of people potentially as an audience for that.
Yeah, definitely. It's just finding the right people to be able to do it and to hold that intention. Yeah, where to.
Well, I think one way to get a start is just with the signed consent of the participants. Tell them that you want to build up an archive of these encounters people are having in the empathy tent, that they'll never be identified by name, they'll never be displayed their own personal image, but these will be interactions that are recorded and used as a source of inspiration for a creative film.
Hmm.
And specific lines might be drawn from their interaction and portrayed in the film, but it won't be identified with them personally. I don't think it would be too difficult with those assurances to get people to contribute to that kind of archive. And when the archive's big enough, and you can select great examples to show to filmmakers, I think that you can build that enthusiasm.
Well, I will send you the video. Would love to see what you think about it, and some maybe the media kit that we have about it. And also, if you have any time to just think about how to get the empathy circle practice out there. I think the one thing about this is it's good to have an actual practice, something tangible. It seems like to me, it's sort of like the minimal viable process, that it's a little structure that incorporates that, that active listening, that empathy, but in a small group. And from there, I just see it as sort of a gateway practice. You got sort of a baseline empathy building practice, and that we can build on that is what we're doing. Build courses on. Well, we have a training. We hold these empathy circles on different topics, and in fact, one of them, I don't know if I sent you that article, the Scientific America article. They mentioned an empathy cafe we did with the community and police. So we brought online, community and members and police together to have empathy circles with each other, and that turned out pretty well. So having events like that, and that was all based on the empathy circle.
I've seen references to that online
Hmm.
where you hold those for the police.
Yeah.
But another possibility is corporations where people tend to do their creative work together as members of small groups. If you had something that you could bring in that was already well organized and tested, and you could provide that as a service, maybe for a fee,
Hmm.
uh, and be able to talk about tangible benefits to employers, that's something that employers might be willing to let you provide to their employees to foster empathy, better communication, better feedback about what other people are thinking and feeling, to produce more cohesive, more respectful, more productive work groups.
Yeah, we're looking at that. We just had our empathy summit, and one of the speakers was talking about how to bring empathy circles into corporations. So definitely, yeah. And we have a training, a 2-day, we call it empathy circle facilitation training to learn how to facilitate these circles. It's pretty simple process, so you don't need, a lot of people can just pick it up very quickly. But to go, when you're dealing with conflict and so forth, the higher level of conflict, the more skills it's good to have. So we have a training for that. So yeah, bring it into the schools and and into corporations, businesses. In fact, I'm co-writing. There's someone that works on empathy in with museums. She's written a couple of books, and she holds regular conferences on how museums can create more empathy. And she has a book she's putting together with a lot of editing with a lot of different authors on actual practices for fostering empathy. So we're working on a chapter for that book on how to do empathy circles in museums. So yeah, that's what we're doing is really seeing how do we get the nuts and bolts into the culture, and all those are great ideas in the corporations and business and schools and museums.
Who's going to sustain all this empathy related activity after you're gone? Do you have successors? Do you have a succession plan? Is there
Yeah,
an
we have a
organization that?
nonprofit. The
Uh-huh.
Empathy Center is a nonprofit, so it's the 501(c)(3), and we have 5 people on the board of directors. So it's when I go, the organization will keep going. So we're really setting the foundation. It's really planting the seeds, so it keeps going and growing. So
Well, it sounds like an exciting time to be doing what you're doing.
yeah, well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, Bill. With as I mentioned, as I said, I saw your work way back when I was first getting started. So you've been really, doing a lot of great work, on this empathic accuracy, and it's a real reference. And people build on your work, right? So you're putting down some foundational work for building this empathy movement, and really appreciate that, and appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about this, and glad to talk anytime on this topic.
And let me reciprocate and tell you how much I've enjoyed finding out about all the things that you and your group are doing. I didn't understand just how diverse those activities were and what the potential was for so many of them. So, congratulations to you and your colleagues. I wish you guys great success. Take it public. Get it as publicized as you possibly can. We've talked about a few ways that could be done. So I hope that you find avenues for making that happen.
Yeah, and spread the word if any of your community friends are interested. We're glad to talk with them and work together and collaborate. So, well,
We'll do
okay,
that, and I'll put them in touch with you.
okay, well, very good, Bill. Real pleasure. So, take care.
Take care.
Bye.